What's up, my friends? I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. And the other day I was sitting around with my family and we didn't really have anything to watch. You ever get to that point where you don't have a book you're working on, you don't have a show you're working on, and then you got these little windows of time with your family, and it's like, well, this is when we watch the thing. This is when we read the thing. What do we do? So I was like, well, we're going to watch a movie. I mean, who does that anymore? But we're going to pick a movie and we're going to watch it. And I found one that looked really cool called A Monster Calls. And it has this big Groot-looking tree monster thing there in the cover art. And I thought, well, that looks pretty fun. Quickly checked a couple of reviews. Looks like, oh, yeah, it's going to work out okay for the kids. There are 3 tales that get told in it. At least that's how it's described. And I'm like, oh, cool. It's like, what are these stories about stories? This is going to be awesome. And it shapes up that way. There's power in story and all of this. But then you figure out pretty quickly that the monster who calls is not this tree monster. The monster that calls is cancer, and cancer strikes at the heart of this already damaged family that this little boy, Connor, is a part of, and it turned out to be a ruthless sob fest. I mean, it was a nicely done show. I see why it won a bunch of awards. But effectively, the show is about this poor kid who the monster / narrator / Liam Neeson describes as too old to still be a child, but too young to be a man, yet burdened with the cares of both, or something like that. It was beautiful. It was artful. And so you encounter the whole story of the process of loss through the lenses of this kid, and there's this familiar rhythm to the whole thing that you recognize from stuff that you heard about in college or high school or somewhere along the way on the internet regarding how people grieve. The idea is that there are these 5 stages of grief, and indeed, you see Connor go through all of these stages as he works through what his mom, who is Jyn Erso from Rogue One, what she's going through. So the first stage is denial, and when we meet young Connor and encounter his situation, this is very much where he's at. He's just got his fingers in his ears and he's pretending the thing isn't happening. As he gradually starts to realize that it is happening, he goes through a destructive phase, lashing out, which again is pretty understandable. And people in the movie, to their credit, are pretty understanding of what the kid's going through. And then we see the bargaining and the heartache, depression phase. And then, of course, because you're an empathetic person and you can tell where this is going, the thrust of the story is, can the kid make it to acceptance? And that's what the monster is trying to help the kid get to. And it's profound, it's powerful, and it made us think a whole bunch. And on the one hand, I think I just want to talk about that movie a little bit. But on the other hand, it's interesting that then I get back into the office and I crack open my Bible and I'm working on the next passage. And the next passage is that exact same process of grief, except it's the disciples who are going through it in regard to what their friend and their leader and their mentor, and they believe their God has just told them, and that's that he's going to die. Now, as you and I have discussed, there are a ton of little hints and references earlier in the text that Jesus drops, some of which are overt, some of which you got to squint pretty closely at to catch. There is one in chapter 9 where Jesus just drops this passing mention of the guests of the bridegroom shouldn't be mourning while he's still with them. I think he specifically says, got it right here, the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, then they will fast. Okay, so there's the first little nod at maybe Jesus is going away. Then in the second of the 5 big speeches around which the book of Matthew is structured, this is the missional discourse in verse 38 of chapter 10. And yes, I wrote this down. I did not know that off the top of my head. You get the one about anyone who loves his father and mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves his son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And, verse 38, anyone who does not take his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. And probably at this point, we're still very much in the denial phase, and the disciples are hearing him say this stuff, but he's young and he's fit and he seems like he's in control of nature. Like, they're not really worried about anything bad befalling their Lord at this point. So they're definitely not going to hear it. It gets a little more overt when we talk about the 2 references to the sign of Jonah and the belly of the whale and all of that, pointing to Jesus' death and even resurrection. And we get 2 separate references to that sign of Jonah, end of chapter 12, as we've discussed, also the beginning of chapter 16. But then you get to the end of chapter 16, and it goes from being little hints that the disciples can maybe brush off aided by the human defense mechanism emotionally that is that first stage of grief, which is denial. But it goes from something brush-offable to something not brush-offable. Verse 21 of Matthew 16, from that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. Now, think about this in terms of the stages of grief. Now Jesus is saying it overtly, and what does he get back as that starts to really register with Peter and the disciples? Anger and bargaining. Never, Lord, there's your anger. But then immediately we get into the bargaining stuff. I'm going to stop it. I will make a deal. I will do something. I will make it so that that does not happen to you. And Jesus blows it off. Like, we're not doing that. We're not bargaining. We're not fighting. We're not going down swinging with anger. That isn't the play here. Peter, you're ignoring the part where I come back to life, and you're ignoring the part where this is the whole plan of God. Jesus is going to make sure they get it. Verse 22, when they came together in Galilee, he said to him, the Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of men. They'll kill him, and on the third day, he'll be raised to life. And the disciples were filled with grief. And there we go. Just like little Connor in A Monster Calls, just like you when your heart was broken by tragedy or death, just like me when my heart has been broken by tragedy or by death. We see this somewhat reliable process of grief. We see it manifesting in all the ways that you'd expect it to manifest, and the disciples come off looking like, I don't know, people, you and me. I mean, it's getting through the armor. They're figuring out there's no angering your way out of this. There's no bargaining your way out of this reality. There's no fighting your way out of this reality. And maybe we call this the fourth phase, because I don't think we're quite to phase 5 yet, where they get the fullness of what Jesus' death and resurrection means. So I don't think we can call what we're seeing here in verses 22 and 23 acceptance. I'm not sure depression is the best word either, but that clinically is the one that gets thrown around for stage 4. So we'll just go with it. This is sadness. This is sorrow. This is depression. They're filled with grief. But isn't it interesting that every time Jesus is hinting at this stuff, save maybe the very first one that we looked at back in chapter 9, it's always immediately chased by this death, but then life. The Son of Man is going to be in the belly of the earth, but just as Jonah was in the belly of the fish for a little while, then he was out of the belly of the fish. You guys remember the story. And likewise, in chapter 16, talking to Peter, and here in chapter 17, both times there's barely even punctuation between Jesus saying that he's going to get killed in Jerusalem and that he's going to be raised back to life on the third day. But the death thing, as it is for you and me, it looms so large, whether we acknowledge that that monster is in our backyard or under our bed, or whether we try to pretend that that monster is not in our backyard or under our bed. The truth is, it is. It's there, and it's coming, and we all know it's coming, and we feel it in our bones, and we see it in the lines at the corners of our smile and of our eyes. We see it chip away at the youth and vitality of other people we love, and please don't take this as negative. I'm not saying, the whole world's a nightmare because death exists, but death is the enemy. And when Jesus says that he's going to build this church and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it, he chose Hades instead of hell because Hades is the word that would conjure the very notion of death, not just the realms of the devil or the evil one. Death is not going to defeat this kingdom. So we have this new rivalry that is taking shape here that is still just a little too ethereal for the disciples to connect with. They, like you or me, simply cannot get past that nagging question of the limited number of years we have and the way death nips at our heels until eventually it catches up. They can't think beyond that pattern. As we move forward, we're going to see them one at a time start to figure out that what this whole thing is about is the redemptive work of Christ defeats death. It defeats imperfection. It defeats sin. It defeats fallenness, the kind that's on purpose, the kind that's unintentional, the kind that's institutional, the kind that's faceless. All of that stuff that is imperfection and death is ultimately defeated in Christ, and what he's going to do on the cross, according to the Bible, is that killing blow. And what a weird, ironic thing it is that to strike the killing blow against death, God is going to take on flesh and die. it is completely understandable that they don't get it, that they're not at step 5 of grief at this point, and that they're at step 4 after denying, after lashing out, after trying to strike a deal or boast about what they're going to do. Now they're to a place where it's like, he didn't stutter. He said exactly what he meant to say. He is going to die. And it's just so difficult for them to conceptualize the idea of there being life after that, that they're locked in a position of sorrow at this point. And I feel empathy because we all know what loss is. We all know what it feels like to try to make sense of that loss when we see it coming from a long ways away, or when it sneaks up on it and we had no idea that that's what we were going to be dealing with today. We get that, and that makes me understand where these dudes are at. But also, this story that Matthew is writing down has this other thing that's lingering in the background, and it's life that defeats the monster of death. And it's hard for the reader, it's hard for the original audience, it's hard for the disciples to comprehend what that's going to look like, but it comes into focus as we come down the home stretch of the book of Matthew, and I'm very excited to unpack all of that with you moving forward. Some of you support the program on Patreon at patreon.com/the TMBH podcast. I don't know how long it's been, a couple weeks or whatever, since I've said thank you for that, but thank you for that. It means a tremendous amount. We've been sending out those field notes guides for Matthew that we had made up to everybody. We've done that in phases and waves. That's a more complicated process than you'd figure. So still, everyone who is a patron at this point, if you haven't got it yet, and most of you should have by now, I think we still have international and a few domestic. Those are coming your way, and thank you for making it so that this is something that I get to do. I don't think you will ever understand how meaningful it is to have a group of people who want to think about these kind of things with this kind of tone. And so I'll just ask you to take my word for it. It's very meaningful and it's very appreciated, and that is not lost on me. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.